Hello everyone, it's been a while. Today I want to talk about black and white squares in chess. So how do I want to start this video? So I want to talk about black and white squares in chess and how the simple idea of black and white squares can kind of lead to much more interesting ideas about intuition in chess and and explain how strong players, or really any player, can sometimes explain their intuition. Right? They can verbalize it, describe why they think white's better, why black's better, why this move's a good move, why that move's a bad move, and why sometimes they can't, and they just have to say, well, it just is, I can just tell. So how I want to start is white squares and black squares. I don't think many chess players have thought about this or realized this, but the color of the squares isn't a necessary feature of a game of chess. If we just had a chessboard that was only one color, right, the squares only had one color, or white squares for instance, it wouldn't actually change anything about the game. It's not like you need those squares to be colored like that for everything to go as it does, The evaluation would still be the same, the rules wouldn't change, everything would just be the same. And so, if we wanted, we could just color in the squares however we wanted. Or we could have no color, right? The squares being colored in are just an extra feature that you might think was added for some sort of aesthetic purpose, right? It makes the board look a bit nicer, gives us that characteristic chessboard pattern. But actually, the squares being colored like that, I think, isn't on accident. So, of course, we could have one row black, one row white, one row black, and so on, and that repeats. We can have any pattern we like. But the reason that the diagonal squares being the same color has significance is because most of the chess pieces control squares of the same color, or at least most of the squares that they cover are the same color. So, of course, in the case of pawns, they control two squares of the same color. Knights control squares all of the same color, so do bishops. And then queens, as I said, kind of proportionally, they'll cover squares of both color, but then because of their diagonal movement, they'll predominantly cover squares of a single color, right? Mostly cover black squares, mostly cover white squares. Rooks and kings are basically colorblind, but most of the pieces, right, 4 out of the 6 pieces, predominantly control a certain color given this arrangement of black and white squares. If we had the squares, if we had the chessboard, one row black, one row white, and so on, that wouldn't really be the case, right? Rooks would control mostly a certain color of square, and so then we might think about chess in a different way. So the reason that it's significant is because a lot of the pieces control the same color of square um, as they are on, or not necessarily as they are on. Like knights control squares, the opposite color of square. So this leads to this idea of like weak type of squares, like weak light squares, weak dark squares, a weak color complex, some people say. And the whole reason that we can say that is because these pieces control a certain number of squares, right? Rooks are not good pieces for exploiting certain color complex weaknesses, and kings for that matter, because they're kind of colorblind, as I said, right? But pawns, knights, bishops, and queens are really good at that, okay? And so we have a way to refer to a position, for instance, where you have the king castled on the king side, and you might move a pawn from g7 to g6, and you'll have pawns on f7 and h7. A strong player might look at that position after you play g6 and say, oh, that's not a good move. Why? Because you weaken the dark squares around your king. But how would we refer to that if there was no such thing as dark squares? Would this idea of color be a thing? Would this concept of having these kind of weaknesses because you're pieces, like the pawns on f7, g6, h7, all control light squares, right? We wouldn't have a way to talk about that if we didn't have any uh, color on the board, right? As I said, we can just remove and put the color on any way we please. It doesn't ultimately impact anything, but it does give us a new way to talk about things and to talk about certain types of weaknesses. And so, isn't that cool? Like, imagine that we had a chest never had any squares colored in, and then there was this one guy that noticed that if he visualized that squares on the same diagonal colored, like in his mind, he would have this new kind of abstract framework for thinking about chess positions and analyzing chess positions. Like, no one else would know about this because he would come up with this nice abstract idea in his mind, and maybe when he sits at home and analyzes, he like colors in the squares himself, but he doesn't tell anyone else. And so when he's playing a game and he notices someone play g6, in his mind he's like, oh, the dark squares are really weak, how can I exploit that, right? But no one else thinks about chess like that because it hasn't been pointed out, it hasn't made obvious, and they don't have a way to describe it because there's no color on the chessboard in this parallel universe. And so that kind of raises this idea, maybe there are other abstractions that we can put on the chessboard, right, that would alter the way we think in important ways if they were only on the board. Like, color is just one example. We could really get really creative with this, think outside the box. Of course, the chessboards are designed that way, so we wouldn't be able to actually do that in the game. But, we could write like a number on each square, for example. A number on each square, and maybe the squares in the middle had higher numbers or something like that. This kind of, I assume, I don't know much about it, but I assume this is kind of what happens when people are programming engines and they have to evaluate positions. They'll make a lot of these things to evaluate a position. And numbers are pretty easy. Like, numbers, I'm trying to think of another example now because color's just, I don't know, to me, that's such a cool example. Like, if that didn't exist, imagine thinking of that. Being like, oh, the pieces preferentially, but mostly control squares of the same color that they're on, apart from the knights, in which case it's the other color, right? They control squares of the same color. And, color wouldn't even be a concept in their mind. Like, you'd say color, be like, what are you talking about color, right? Well, if you color in the squares on a chessboard like this, then they would control the same color. Okay, well, what's the point of that? Well, then look at this position where they play g6. All the squares that are colored in black are really, really weak now. And they probably still wouldn't believe you because they haven't been brought up through their whole education, chess education, exposed to this idea of color. They're like, how is that useful? But then, you get strong chess players who have been playing for so long, you play a move and they just instantly realize, oh, all the squares of that color are super weak. So imagine if we just added something else onto a chessboard, right? Or came up with some other kind of abstract conceptual framework that we could just apply onto the board, which doesn't change any of the rules, doesn't influence the game in any way, but it gives us a new lens through which we can evaluate and intuit the evaluation of a position. And so another thought is that if we didn't have color, right, if the squares didn't have any color, would eventually grandmasters who play in this parallel universe where none of the squares are colored in, would they still be able to intuit that g6 is a bad move? Because as we would describe it, it weakens the dark squares. But would they be able to say when they see g6, oh, no, it's not a good move? Now, if we ask the GMs and so on in this world, why is that a bad move? They will explain to us, well, the dark squares are weak and really opening up the dark squares. But in this other universe, there wouldn't be such thing as dark squares. And so unless we'd developed a vocabulary to explain it, I don't know what we would say, but unless we had some explicit way to describe it, they wouldn't be able to describe it. They would just say, well, no, it's just a bad move. They might say it weakens your king, right? But there might be instances where you weaken the color complex and it has nothing to do with your king, right? So In that case, they might say weaken your king. If you just weaken all the colors, a color complex, a lot of squares in the middle, you have pawn on c4, d5, e4, f3, b3 or something, you say, oh, it, how would they describe it? Would they just say, oh, it just doesn't feel right? So imagine that we didn't have that color framework to think about chess, they wouldn't be able to describe why the position's like that. And so imagine, as I said, we could put so many different conceptual, we could think about chess through so many different lenses by just imposing these kind of abstract properties such as color onto the board without altering the rules or the evaluation or anything about the game, only altering how we think about it, to think about it. Probably wouldn't be worth it. It's not like this is practical advice. You have to start thinking about ways that you can think about the chessboard. Oh, this one's like a shade of green. This square's a little bit higher than this square up in the air, and things like that. That would just not be very practical, and you've lived your whole chess life, you know, thinking about color, and so it's kind of built in to your intuition. It'll probably take a long time to build in other abstract concepts, especially if you've made them up yourself and you're the only one that references them and uses them. So it's more of kind of just for, a thought experiment, I suppose, food for thought. So imagine that there are just all these possible ways to think about a position that could explain these kind of uh, ineffable, um, how would you say? Yeah, it's kind of ironic, ineffable. Um, like you show a position to a grandmaster and you say like, well, why is this a good position? They'd be like, of course, there's a very large repertoire of kind of general things that chess players can point to describe positions, which has kind of evolved due to the need of stronger players to explain things to younger players, not younger, but weaker players when teaching them. So they grab the king's weak and white's got the center and more developed pieces and so on and so forth. But there's sometimes moves that people don't really know how to say why they're bad, and they just say, well, it just feels like that's a bad move. Maybe if we had that extra, abstraction like color out that somewhere out there, right? We just got to think about it. We impose that onto the board, this abstraction. Lets us think about chess in a new way. We would be able to explain that reasoning, why we think it's a bad move. Just like the GMs in the colorless world, right, or the one color chessboard world, wouldn't be able to describe why G6 is a bad move. In our world, we can describe it because we have this interesting pattern on the chessboard. It just so happens that due to the way the pieces move, it's not an arbitrary pattern. It actually has a very relevant connection to chess games and how the pieces move, and so therefore we can explain why G6 is a bad move. That was just some thoughts I had about the color on the chessboard and how interesting it is to realize that it's completely arbitrary and we could have any coloring on the chessboard we like. We could have other things, like I said, A1 could literally be lower in three-dimensional space than A2, for example, and then A3. And that kind of different height doesn't have to necessarily go bigger towards the center, it could go small, and then it could have any pattern. Of course, the pattern that you impose have to have some connection to the inherent rules of chess. As I said, the rules of how the pieces move are connected to the way that we color the board diagonally, simply because if we color the board diagonally, the pieces, typically most of the pieces, will primarily move to squares of similar color. So there is that inherent connection there, which means that the way we color is meaningful. Okay, you can't just do anything. But if you do come up with that kind of abstraction that doesn't influence the rules but has an inherent connection to some aspect of the rules of chess, then you might be able to think about the game in a new way, which is really interesting. Anyway, that's it for today. Bye.